Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And in this episode, I want to look at two different ways in which the Holocaust was approached in West Germany after 1949. The era of Comrade Adenauer as Chancellor of Germany threw up a number of challenges to the nascent democracy in West Germany, dealing with the legacy not just of the Holocaust itself, but the wider legacy of Germany and the Second World War. So the brilliant book on this subject, and I've drawn from it before, is Divided Memory by Jeffrey Herf, which discusses the various ways in East and West Germany that history was remembered. And I think it's really important to look at historical memory from time to time, because the way in which the past is remembered really is a very, very selective and subjective experience. The understanding that British people have when going to watch Dunkirk, for example, is really, really a different experience to anybody else, and it's a really kind of deep cultural and socially constructed notion of what the past is and what it isn't. And questions of guilt, victimhood, and justice, again, are very different and culturally dependent. There were large numbers of people in East and West Germany that saw German people as having been some of the biggest victims of the war and some of the bearers of the greatest suffering. And there's some validity to this point of view, again, if you ignore the fact that it was Hitler that really began the war in September 1939. But most German people didn't view themselves as having any accountability or responsibility for that whatsoever. The question of the suffering of the Jews, therefore, often takes a second place in German memory and German mentalities in the 40s and 50s, because people looked at their cities bombed to rubble and thought about the million or so rapes perpetrated on German women by the Red Army. They thought about German prisoners still in the Soviet Union and large numbers of German people killed in the firebombing of cities like Hamburg. And there was a sense that, German people have suffered, it's awful what's happened to the Jews, but look at what happened to us. Now, the two most significant politicians of the era are obviously Konrad Adenauer, the Christian Democratic leader of West Germany from 1949 to 1962, and Kurt Schumacher, the Social Democrat leader. Schumacher, far more an orthodox Marxist, was seen by many in the centre ground of German politics during this period as being one of the most indispensable sources of Adenauer's continued power, that there really didn't appear to be a credible opposition on the left to Konrad Adenauer. Konrad Adenauer looked pragmatically on the question of the past. He said, if you want to establish a democracy in Germany, you need to brush certain things under the carpet, certain unpleasant things, that if they were dragged out into the open, would reignite all sorts of historical and social conflict and make it very difficult to establish a liberal democracy in this country. Schumacher has an entirely different view. Schumacher said, if you do that, then you will store up problems for the future. That in order for democracy to be born, that honesty and truth must go with it, and there must be a settling of accounts, and the guilty parties must be brought to justice in order for a new chapter in German history to be created. There seem to be merits in both arguments, and there seems to be a degree of realism in both arguments. Though you might argue in what Schumacher was having to say, there was more idealism there as well. Now, this isn't to portray Adenauer as a complete cynic. He was horrified by the German past. He is horrified by the Holocaust and what had happened. But he was of the mindset that the present moment was much more important, and it was to preserve the present moment in all of Germany's, West Germany's frailties and vulnerabilities, that the struggle had to happen. Adenauer believed that German history needed, in some ways, to be completely derailed. The notion of Sonderweg in German history, of Germany having a special path through history, that Germany, every country has this notion of exceptionalism, that they're completely different and they don't follow any of the paths of other countries. But in the eyes of Adenauer, German exceptionalism, the German Sonderweg, was much more dangerous, and this had been shown to be so because of the Second World War. In order to break the power of the Sonderweg, Germany had to be now integrated into the Western Alliance of NATO, and later the EEC, or the EU as it would become. And this would suppress a Nazi or a nationalist revival, whereas a neutral Germany, the kind of Germany that Stalin had originally proposed, unify Germany in a fairly short timescale, keep it neutral, neither in the Warsaw Pact nor NATO, but it would certainly have been fallen within Stalin's sphere of influence eventually. This Germany might not actually become the Stalinist satellite that Stalin rather hoped for. Instead, it might actually become a dangerously autonomous nation in the eyes of Adenauer. Adenauer essentially felt that Germany, based on its own past, couldn't be trusted to not be in a Western alliance if it was simply its own power within Central Europe. He believed all sorts of dangerous tendencies would return to the fore, and Nazism might re-establish itself very quickly, or a variant thereof. Whether this would have happened in an era of nuclear power and Cold War conflict is questionable. I suspect perhaps it wouldn't have done, but what I think is not anywhere near as important or relevant as what Adenauer appeared to believe in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Adenauer had another reason for wanting to embed West Germany within the Western Alliance, and he thought that a religious Christian West, which arguably isn't really, would be a powerful ally to West Germany in the war against an atheistic communism. Schumacher looked on things rather differently. Schumacher said, well, Germany had, up until Hitler, the largest social democratic party in Europe, and the Social Democrats have revived themselves. Schumacher had spent most of the war in Dachau and had survived Nazism, though his body was really quite badly damaged and his health never really fully recovered. But he said that social democracy had recovered in West Germany, and this meant that there was a robust set of ideologies and traditions and beliefs and democratic notions within Germany. It meant that West Germany didn't really have to rely too much on the Western Alliance to ensure that it remained a democratic society. And Schumacher looked to the way in which integration into NATO was happening under Adenauer's watch, and he said, Adenauer has said specifically to NATO that in order for West German cooperation, i.e. American bases on West German soil and that kind of thing, it is politic for the NATO allies to allow the question of the Holocaust and of the arrest and prosecution of perpetrators to drop. Therefore, integration into NATO comes at a very dangerous price indeed. It comes at the price of allowing Nazis to slink away into the undergrowth and to re-emerge as pillars of society without the threat of any kind of punishment at all. Germany has to sell quite a significant part of its soul. West Germany has to sell quite a significant part of its soul in order to get into NATO itself, and the person who is selling is Adenauer. Adenauer had an interesting view of Germany and Europe's Jews. The belief that Germany should embrace the Western European democratic modernity and reject its Sonderweg had an understanding of what the Jews represented at its heart. The Jews, in Adenauer's eyes, were an inseparable part of the West, and they were one of the great achievements and some of the great achievers of Western European modernity. They were part of the development of bourgeois society in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they were an inseparable part of the West and an opponent, in his eyes, of atheistic communism. Adenauer was cautious not to mention the Holocaust directly. This was something that could not really be discussed or articulated, but indirectly he lavished praise on Europe's Jews, and this can be seen in an archive of letters between Adenauer and his oldest friend, Danny Heinemann, a Jewish Belgian-American businessman and a person who Adenauer had known since before the First World War. In the letters, which begin in 1945, the question of the Holocaust is never raised. But Adenauer wrote highly personal accounts of his fears for Europe, his worries about Soviet communism and the Soviet threat to Europe. And these were translated and given to Eisenhower as a convenient way of informing the American president about how the thinking of Adenauer was really forming and shaping and developing. Anyway, suffice to say, Eisenhower likes what he sees and sees Adenauer as a key Cold War ally. In some of the letters, he makes the point, and perhaps he knew that they were being passed to Eisenhower for a reading, that the delivery of German suspected war criminals to France, for example, for trial and punishment, had created much bad blood between Germany and France as new allies, and both Adenauer and Kurt Schumacher write that there is a general feeling of anti-militarism in Germany at the end of World War II, deep resentment and anger towards the army, and a sense that if it hadn't been for militarism, Germany would not have been devastated in the way that they had been. Adenauer had previously argued that Western occupation rules and policies would be dangerous to efforts to create democracy. They simply seem to create resentment. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that, for example, denazification policies, which were pursued most vigorously in the American sectors and half-heartedly, really, by the British, have a questionable impact on changing any ideas and values at all. The policies that are implemented in the Western zones of occupation, argues Adenauer, far from fostering democracy, they keep memories of the war alive and create an unfavourable atmosphere. Adenauer was keen to end denazification, not out of any sympathy for the Nazis, but out of an understanding that what most West German people wanted was an ability to inhabit some kind of historical amnesia, as simply the right to sweep unpleasant truths under the carpet. Denazification policies in West Germany were seen as an unending punishment, and obviously large numbers of people claimed that they had never been Nazis, or they had simply been coerced into being party members, or they had been obliged to take part in some of the crimes of the state. How true this is probably almost impossible to gauge, but it was a convenient justification that lots of people had, so they could say, well, all these awful things happened, sure, yeah, but it wasn't me, and I don't need to be reminded of it day in, day out, because I didn't do anything. Danny Heinemann wrote a revealing letter in March 1951 to John J. McCloy, the US High Commissioner for Germany, in which he said, Adenauer's intense Germanism is coupled with a limited experience of foreign countries. It may perhaps be somewhat difficult for him to realise that people west of the Rhine are not too quickly impressed by Germany's good intentions, whatever government may be in office. And Adenauer was kind of on the horns of a dilemma. Obviously, living in Nazi Germany had created a sort of an enforced provincialism where it was difficult really for a regional politician like Adenauer to have had any knowledge or diplomatic understanding of the outside world. But very soon after becoming Chancellor of Germany, he had to integrate Germany into the Western Alliance, and he thought that that by doing this, it would enable a democracy to flourish in Germany that was based on a historical amnesia, but actually part of the price of integrating Germany into the Western Alliance in the first place was a fuller acknowledgement of Germany's crimes. Western leaders were not entirely happy about embracing a Germany that simply said it hadn't really done anything. And it's not particularly because the leaders of Britain, France, America and other countries were above a bit of cynicism themselves, but their populations having to make friends with their most recent mortal enemies had to have some kind of gesture from Germany that it was serious about moving on from the Nazi past and able to acknowledge what that past actually was. In the election of the summer of 1949, which was based largely on what kind of economic model West Germany would follow, the plan that was set out by Adenauer was a vote to end denazification, a vote to end the trials of former Nazi officials, a vote to stop the purges of former Nazi Party members from industry and the civil service. And even though Adenauer is clearly an anti-Nazi figure, his victory creates a Bundestag which has a significant majority in favour of ending the discussion about Nazi-era crimes. And he was able to tap into a sense of German victimhood. So his first speech to the Bundestag, he said that essentially great progress had been made in Germany since 1945, but he said, and I quote, Germany and the German people are not yet free or equal to others, and the two Germanys were now divided. And then he says something quite extraordinary. He says, denazification had brought out much unhappiness and harm, and that he said that those who are really guilty of crimes committed during the National Socialist period and in the war should be punished with all severity, but that in Germany should not be divided into two classes, those without political blemishes and those with such blemishes. And this distinction must become overcome as soon as possible. Now, what he was saying there, really, and this was very popular stuff he was saying, was that obviously, the Goerings and the Himmlers deserved what they got, but the end to denazification was a positive thing, because there were a great many people who, yes, had been in the Nazi Party and perhaps really regretted it now, and really hadn't really done anything particularly awful, but were being made to suffer for it as well by hyper-judgmental and over-zealous prosecutors and investigators. And when he talks about two classes, those with political blemishes and those with no such blemishes, the idea of a blemish, an unfortunate entry in a ledger of Nazi Party membership against one's name that destroys an otherwise valuable career and a morally upstanding life. That is a way of kind of exploring and using what is a significant grey area in German life. Historians like Ian Kershaw and Richard J. Evans show that yes, there were large numbers of people that were sort of compromised by Nazism and involved with Nazism on a whole range of different levels who interacted, took what they could from Nazism, tried to stay out of trouble. This sort of vast grey area of complicated interactions with the regime, which didn't make them Heinrich Himmler, but it certainly didn't make them, Sophie Scholl at the other end of the spectrum either. Adenauer said, "The government of the Federal Republic, in the belief that many have subjectively atoned for a guilt that was not heavy, is determined where it appears acceptable to do so to put the past behind us, i.e. to offer an amnesty. On the other hand, is absolutely determined to draw the necessary lessons from the past regarding all those who challenge the existence of our state, whether they come now from right-wing radicalism or left-wing radicalism." Far more often, Adenauer spoke out about the fate of prisoners of war, German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. He seems to have made, after 1945, really only one major utterance about the Jews and about how unacceptable anti-Semitism in Germany was. But he spoke repeatedly about the fate of German POWs in Russia. Schumacher pointed out that in all of Adenauer's speeches he had uttered not one word about the anti-Nazi resistance or victims of fascism. He said that one could not be against Nazism without thinking about its victims and by establishing a hierarchy among them. In response to Adenauer's only comment about the Jews, Schumacher said, "What was said in Adenauer's government statement about the Jews yesterday and the frightful tragedy of the Jews in the Third Reich was too feeble and too weak. Resigned comments and a tone of regret in this matter don't help at all. It is not only the duty of international socialists to place the fate of German and European Jews in the forefront of attention and to offer help where it is needed. It is also the duty of every German patriot to do so. By the extermination of 6 million Jewish human beings, Hitler barbarism disgraced the German people. We will have to bear the consequences of this disgrace for the unforeseeable future. Of the 600,000 German Jews today in the 4 occupation zones, only 30,000, most old and ill, remain." 600,000 he meant in pre-war Germany. And even they repeatedly experienced shameful and degrading episodes. In Germany, no political current should forget that every form of nationalism has anti-Semitic effects, and that every form of anti-Semitism fosters nationalism. Such trends would bring about Germany's voluntary isolation from the world. Anti-Semitism rests on ignorance and of the great contributions of German Jews to the German economy, German intellectual life, to German culture, and to the fight for German freedom and German democracy. Today the German people would be better off if these strengths of Jewish intellect and economic potential were included in the construction of a new Germany. Despite Schumacher's brave comments and his ability to really shame Adenauer in his reticence to speak about the Holocaust at all, the American High Commissioner of Germany commissioned a poll in November 1949, and the survey found that only 30% of respondents rejected National Socialism outright, and 59% thought it had been a good idea badly carried out. In 8 nationwide surveys between 1951 and December 1952, 41% of respondents said more good than evil came from Nazi ideas, and only 36% saw more evil than good. There were only 4% that thought that all Germans bore a certain guilt for Germany's actions during the Third Reich, and only 21% felt some responsibility for rectifying these wrongs. This meant that there was little public appetite for what Schumacher had to say, and this unfortunately reflected in the SPD's electoral successes, or lack thereof, throughout the Adenauer era. Okay, so I hope you found that useful, especially if you're looking at the Holocaust and or West Germany in the post-war era. Do remember to give us a good thumbs up on iTunes. A good review always goes a long way. And if you can check out our Patreon page, that would be absolutely terrific too. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye-bye.